She was 21 and put out of her own home. No family left to claim her, no money, and no plan, just a small, hand-carved bird in her pocket and the $6 from the sale of her mother's locket. And with that $6, she bought the rights to salvage a sunken rowboat from the Clackamas River. But what nobody knew was that sealed inside its waterlogged hull was a secret that would not only prove her father was murdered, but give her the means to reclaim everything he had built. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from tonight. Her real name was Bernice, a name she felt belonged to someone else, someone heavier and slower. Her father, Thomas Hollis, had called her Birdie from the time she was a small girl, a name that fit her quick, watchful movements and her habit of perching on fences and woodpiles to observe the world. The name was sealed forever when, for her 7th birthday, he gave her a small wren, carved from a single piece of mountain mahogany, its tiny form fitting perfectly in the palm of her hand. Thomas was a prospector, a man more at home in the high, lonely canyons of the Cascades than in the small house he kept in Oregon City. His life was a cycle of departures and returns, of dusty hope and occasional modest reward. For his wife, Eleanor, and her son from a previous marriage, Cassius, his absences were a trial, and his profession a source of constant, low-grade shame. They saw him as a dreamer chasing fool's gold while other men built respectable lives as merchants or clerks. But for Birdie, his returns were the center of her year. He would come home smelling of pine sap and campfire smoke, his beard flecked with mica, and his pockets full of strange, beautiful rocks. He taught her the language of the earth, the rusty stain of iron, the greasy feel of soapstone, the sharp, crystalline edges of quartz. He taught her how to work a pan in the cold rush of a creek, swirling away the sand and gravel to find the satisfying weight of color at the bottom. He taught her patience, a virtue he believed was the only true tool a person needed. Her own mother had died of a fever when Birdie was too young to form lasting memories, leaving behind only a faint scent of lavender and a silver locket with a wisp of blonde hair inside. Thomas, lost in his own grief and ill-suited to raising a daughter alone, had married Eleanor a year later. The union was one of practicality, not passion, and the house was cleaved by a quiet, invisible line. On one side were Eleanor and Cassius, who valued propriety and currency. On the other were Birdie and her father, who valued granite, grit, and the promise of what lay hidden. This division left Birdie with long, solitary hours to fill, especially when her father was away in the mountains. She found her refuge down by the river in the workshop of Silas Croft, a widowed boatwright in his late 60s. The shop was a cathedral of wood, smelling perpetually of cedar shavings and hot tar. Silas, a man of few words and deeply competent hands, saw in the quiet, observant girl a spirit kindred to his own. He never spoke down to her. He simply made room for her on his workbench, handing her a piece of scrap wood and a small, sharp knife. He taught her the life of trees, reading their history in the grain of a plank. He taught her the proper way to hold a draw knife, peeling away fragrant curls of wood to shape a curve. He taught her the heft and balance of an adze, the satisfying thud as it bit into an oak rib. He taught her that anything made of wood held a memory, and that with enough care, nothing was ever truly broken beyond repair. It could always be salvaged, repurposed, or returned to the earth with respect. Under his patient, silent tutelage, Birdie's hands became as knowing as her eyes. She learned to caulk a seam, to steam and bend a plank, to plane a surface until it was as smooth as water. She learned the quiet satisfaction of work, the steady rhythm of a task done well, and a self-reliance that grew in her like a strong, straight tree. She carried her father's carved bird in her pocket always, a dense, smooth weight against her leg, a reminder of his love. And she carried Silas's lessons in her hands, a knowledge of how to mend what was broken, a skill she had no idea she would soon need not for a boat, but for her own life. The last time she saw her father, He was more excited than she had ever known him to be. He had spent the previous winter studying maps and assay reports, and he believed he had finally found it. A significant silver lode, high up on the slopes of Tanner Creek. He had taken on a partner, a man named Jacob Finch, who had put up the capital for better equipment. Finch was a newcomer to the area, a man with smooth hands and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Birdie did not trust him, a feeling she kept to herself, knowing her father was swept up in the venture. "This is it, Birdie," Thomas had said, his eyes bright. "This one will set us right. No more debts, no more apologies. A proper house for you. Everything." He was secretive about the exact location, even with her, a precaution against claim jumpers. He promised to be back in a month, 2 at the most, with ore samples that would silence all the doubters. He kissed her forehead, his beard scratching her skin, and then he was gone, his mule loaded with supplies, heading for the high country. A month passed, measured in the slow lengthening of the summer evenings. Then, too, Birdie's anxiety grew into a low, constant hum beneath the surface of her days. Then, a rider came down from the logging camps in the foothills, bringing news. Thomas Hollis was dead. His body had been found snagged on a logjam in the Clackamas River, miles downstream from where his claim was presumed to be. The official story, passed from the rider to the town sheriff and then to the family, was that it had been a tragic accident. He must have slipped on a slick rock while crossing the creek, hit his head, and fallen into the water, the current carrying him away. Eleanor and Cassius received the news with a practiced somber gravity. There were no great outpourings of grief. For them, it was the final, unfortunate end to a life of foolish risks. That evening, the administrative cruelty began. Cassius, now 24 and assuming the role of the man of the house with unnerving ease, called Birdie to the kitchen table. He had papers laid out in a neat, damning stack, he explained, in a calm, almost bored tone, that his stepfather had been not just a dreamer, but a reckless one. He had taken out significant loans against their small house to fund his last expedition. Finch had confirmed it. The Tanner Creek claim was a bust, worthless rock. The debts were now due. There was nothing left. The house would have to be sold to settle accounts. Eleanor stood by the stove, her back to the room, polishing a copper pot that was already gleaming. She did not look at Birdie. "There is no room for you where we are going, Bernice," she said, using the formal name that always felt like a punishment. "We will be taking a small apartment. You are of age now. It is time you made your own way in the world." There was no malice in her voice, only a flat final dismissal. It was a simple closing of a ledger. Birdie felt a strange calm settle over her. She did not cry or plead. To do so would have been to give them a satisfaction she was unwilling to provide. She looked at Cassius's smooth, impassive face, at her stepmother's rigid back, and she understood that this had been decided long ago. She simply nodded. She went to her small room and packed a canvas satchel, a spare dress, her father's whetstone, a bar of soap, and the worn copy of Leaves of Grass he had given her. Before she closed the bag, she took her mother's silver locket from its box and slipped it into her pocket. At the door, she paused. She turned back to the kitchen, where Cassius was already stacking his papers. She laid the house key on the table beside his hand. Then she walked out, closing the door quietly behind her, leaving the only home she had ever known without a single backward glance. The $6 she got from the jeweler for the locket felt like both an insult and a fortune. It was all she had. Birdie walked away from the house, her steps steady and measured. She moved through the familiar streets of Oregon City, past the mercantile and the blacksmith's shop, acutely aware of the curious glances and sudden silences that followed her. The news of her father's death and her subsequent eviction had already made its way through the town's swift and merciless network of gossip. She was the prospector's orphan, the foolish girl left with nothing. She saw pity in some faces, a cold satisfaction in others. She met no one's eyes. She had no destination, no plan beyond putting one foot in front of the other. Her feet, acting on an instinct deeper than thought, carried her away from the town center and down the dusty track that led to the Clackamas River. The air grew cooler, scented with damp earth and the sharp fragrance of cottonwood trees. The sound of the water, a low and constant murmur, grew louder, and with it came a sense of solace. This was the landscape of her childhood, the place she had always gone to escape the stifling quiet of her stepmother's house. She followed the river path until she came to a familiar, dilapidated structure half hidden by overgrown salmonberry bushes. It was Silas Croft's old workshop. The boatwright had passed away 2 winters prior, and the place had been left to the slow, patient reclamation of the wilderness. The windows were broken, and the roof sagged in the middle, but the sturdy post and beam frame, built by Silas's own hands, still stood strong. She pushed open the groaning door. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon light. The air was thick with the ghost smell of cedar and tar. Tools lay on the workbench where Silas had left them, coated in a fine layer of dust and rust, a collection of saws, hand planes, and chisels. It felt less like an abandonment and more like a long pause. She swept a corner of the floor clean with a broken piece of board and set down her satchel. This would be her shelter. For the next several weeks, she lived a marginal existence. She rose with the sun and spent her days in a careful calculus of survival. Using the skills Silas had taught her, she took on small mending jobs from the farmers and fishermen who lived on the outskirts of town, those who cared more for sound work than for social standing. She repaired a broken chair for a handful of potatoes, patched a leaky bucket for a small bag of flour, replaced a rotted fence post for a few cents. She ate sparingly, hoarding the $6 from her mother's locket as if it were the last money on earth. Most of her time, however, was spent by the river. It was the source of her father's death, yet she felt no malice toward it. It was a force of nature, indifferent and powerful, and she found its presence calming. One morning, while scavenging for driftwood, she saw something snagged on a gravel bar in a shallow bend about 100 yards downstream from the old ferry landing. It was a dark, curved shape, the unmistakable line of a boat's hull, mostly submerged in the silty water. Curiosity pulled her closer. She waded out into the cold current, the water swirling around her knees. It was a rowboat about 16 feet long, clinker-built with cedar planking over oak ribs. It was a wreck, half filled with mud and gravel, a large, jagged hole stove in its port side. But the wood, what she could see of it, was good. Silas had taught her to see the potential in such things. The cedar was tight-grained, the oak ribs still solid. There was more usable lumber in that wreck than she could hope to buy in a year. An idea, born of desperation and ingrained practicality, began to form. She could salvage it. The wood alone was worth the effort. The next day, she walked into town and went to the office of the county clerk, a fussy, balding man named Mr. Peters. She asked about the Sunken boat. Peters peered at her over his spectacles. That old wreck? Been stuck on that bar since the big flood back in April. It belonged to Jacob Finch. He filed a loss report on it, said it wasn't worth the cost of fetching it out. The name struck her like a physical blow. Finch, her father's partner. The man who had confirmed the mine was worthless. "I want to buy the salvage rights," Bertie said, her voice steady. Peters raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "The rights? Girl, it's trash." "I'll give you $6 for them," she said, laying the entirety of her fortune on the counter. The clerk stared at the coins, then at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. He saw a fool and an easy $6. He drew up a simple bill of sale, his pen scratching across the paper. For the sum of $6, paid in full, all salvage rights to 1-1, Sunken Rowboat, location specified as the gravel bar south of the Clackamas ferry landing. are hereby transferred to Miss Bernice Hollis." The whispers followed her as she left the clerk's office. The Hollis girl had finally lost her senses. Buying a waterlogged piece of garbage. Let them talk. She had the paper in her pocket and a purpose in her heart. The task of moving the boat was monumental. It lay heavy and inert, a dead weight of wood and water and silt held fast by the river's grip. Bertie had no horse, no winch, no block and tackle. All she had were her own 2 hands, Silas's lessons in leverage and mechanics, and a stubborn refusal to fail. She spent the first day simply observing. She watched the way the current flowed around the hull, where it pushed and where it pulled. She noted the slope of the gravel bar and the position of the large driftwood logs scattered along the bank. Silas had always said that nature would do half the work if you only had the patience to let it. Her plan was not one of brute force, but of slow, methodical persuasion. She began by bailing. Using an old bucket she had repaired, she started the back-breaking work of emptying the hull. For hours, she scooped and lifted, her movements becoming a rhythmic cycle of dip, pull, heave, and splash. The water was frigid, and her muscles quickly began to ache with a deep, burning fatigue. As the water level inside the boat dropped, it grew marginally lighter, but it was still laden with a thick, heavy slurry of mud and gravel. She used her hands to scoop out the muck, handful by painful handful, until the oak ribs were exposed. With the boat partially emptied, she turned her attention to the river itself. Using a long, sturdy pole she salvaged from the riverbank, she began to work on the boat's position. She wedged the pole against a submerged rock and pushed against the stern, not trying to move it much, just to shift its angle by a few inches, allowing the current to get a better purchase on its side. It was a slow, grueling process. The pole would slip, and she would have to reset, her arms trembling with the effort. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, the boat began to pivot, its bow swinging downstream. The next step was to get it out of the water. She scavenged the riverbank for materials. She found a length of thick, frayed rope, probably lost from a ferry crossing, and a half-dozen straight, smooth logs of driftwood, each about 5 or 6 feet long. These would be her rollers. She spent an entire day digging, using a flat piece of shale as a spade to create a shallow, gently sloping ramp in the gravel, leading from the water's edge up onto the bank. She then maneuvered 2 of the driftwood logs into the water and worked them under the bow of the boat. With the rope tied securely to the bow, she looped the other end around a large, deeply rooted cottonwood tree on the bank. She pulled, not with the strength of her arms, but with the full weight of her body, leaning back until the rope was taut. The boat groaned. The bow scraped against the gravel, then lifted slightly and settled onto the rollers. It had moved less than a foot, but it had moved. For the next 3 days, this was her life. Pull, strain, reset the rollers. The work was a relentless cycle of exhaustion and small victories. The skin on her hands was raw, her back a knot of pain. Sometimes, people from town would stop on the bridge to watch her, a lone figure wrestling with a wreck. She could feel their pity and their scorn, but she blocked it out, focusing only on the task, on the feel of the rope in her hands, and the grating sound of the hull moving over the gravel. Finally, on the evening of the 7th day, the entire boat was clear of the water, resting on the gravel bar like a beached whale. It was a sorry sight. The cedar planks were scarred and bleached, the gunwale was splintered, and the gaping hole in its side looked like a mortal wound. Any other person would have seen only firewood. But Bertie saw the tight grain of the wood, the sturdy oak frame, and the ghost of the elegant vessel it had once been. As she ran her hand along the hull, inspecting the damage more closely, her fingers brushed against a section near the stern that felt wrong. It was too thick, too solid. She tapped it with her knuckles. The sound was a dull, dense thud, completely different from the hollow resonance of the rest of the hull. She tapped again, her brow furrowed. Silas had shown her boats with small, sealed compartments for buoyancy, but this felt different. It was a section about 3 feet long and a foot wide, seamlessly integrated into the hull. There was no hatch, no visible seam. It was a hidden space, deliberately concealed. A cold knot of premonition tightened in her stomach. This was not an accident. This was a secret. The sun was sinking below the western hills, painting the river in hues of orange and purple. The curious onlookers from town had long since departed, leaving Bertie alone in the twilight with the river, the wreck, and the burgeoning mystery of the hidden compartment. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had to get inside. The hull was far too heavy to move any further. She would have to break it open right here on the gravel bar. She walked the half-mile back to Silas's old workshop, the place that was now both her home and her armory. The air inside was cool and still. She moved with purpose, her exhaustion replaced by a sharp, focused energy. She gathered the tools she would need, items she had cleaned and oiled in the preceding weeks, resurrecting them from their dusty slumber. She chose a heavy wooden mallet with a well-worn handle, a set of 3 iron wedges of varying sizes, a long, flat pry bar, and a small, keen-edged hatchet that had been Silas's favorite for fine work. Returning to the riverbank, she found the boat silhouetted against the fading light. The world had gone quiet. The only sounds the rush of the water over the stones and the distant call of a nightjar. She knelt beside the stern, running her fingers over the section of double hull, again confirming its dimensions. Silas had taught her that a boat is a puzzle, and if you understand how it was put together, you can understand how to take it apart. She would not use brute force, but a careful, surgical deconstruction. She started at the seam where the top plank of the strange section met the one above it. With the hatchet, she carefully chipped away the old, hardened tar and caulking. Then, taking the smallest wedge and the mallet, she found a tiny gap in the seam and tapped the wedge into it. The wood groaned in protest. She moved to the other end of the plank and did the same. Then she took the next-sized wedge, driving it in beside the first, widening the gap. The process was slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was small against the vastness of the evening. She worked by feel as much as by sight, sensing the resistance of the wood, the slow yielding of the old iron nails. Finally, a narrow crack appeared along the length of the plank. She inserted the tip of the pry bar into the gap and leaned on it, using her whole body as a lever. There was a sharp crack, the sound of wood fibers tearing, and then a long, splintering groan. The plank popped free. She tossed it aside and peered into the space she had revealed. It was dark, but she could see it was a cavity, just as she'd suspected. Between the inner and outer planks of the hull was a void, and it was not empty. The space had been packed with sawdust to prevent any rattling, and nestled within it, wrapped in a thick, dark bundle, was an object. Her heart began to pound, a heavy, insistent drum against her ribs. For the first time since leaving her father's house, her hands trembled. She reached into the compartment, her fingers brushing against the coarse texture of oilcloth. She pulled the object out. It was a satchel, tightly wrapped and bound with multiple loops of waxed cord, its surface slick with a thin coating of tar to ensure it was waterproof. It was heavier than she expected. She stood up, holding the package in her hands. It felt dangerous, like a dormant thing that was about to wake up. Without a thought for the ruined boat, or the tools scattered on the gravel, she turned and carried her discovery back toward the dark, quiet sanctuary of Silas's shack. Inside, she barred the door. The only light was a single tallow candle she lit and placed on the workbench. Its small, flickering flame cast long, dancing shadows across the walls. She placed the satchel on the clean-swept floor and knelt before it. With methodical care, she unwound the waxed cord, her fingers fumbling slightly. Then she began to unwrap the layers of stiff, tarred oilcloth. As the last layer fell away, the contents were revealed, perfectly preserved and dry. In the flickering candlelight of the abandoned workshop, the secrets of the sunken boat lay exposed. There were 3 items inside the oilcloth wrap. The first was a bundle of official-looking papers, folded neatly and tied with a simple piece of twine. Bertie's hands were surprisingly steady as she untied the knot and spread the documents on the floor. They were deeds. She recognized the first one immediately. The deed for the Tanner Creek lode, the silver claim her father had been so certain of. His signature, a familiar, confident script, was there at the bottom. But as she looked at the second and third documents, a cold dread washed over her. They were deeds for 2 other claims further up the valley, both signed over to Mr. Jacob Finch. Tucked beneath these was a 4th paper, a bill of sale transferring the ownership of the Tanner Creek lode from Thomas Hollis to Jacob Finch. It was dated the day after her father's body was officially discovered. She stared at the signature. It was a crude, clumsy imitation of her father's hand, the lines hesitant and uneven where his had been fluid. It was a forgery, a blatant, shameless forgery. The second item was a small, leather-bound ledger, the kind used for keeping business accounts. She opened it. The pages were filled with columns of dates, figures, and notes, all written in Finch's precise, cramped handwriting. The entries detailed ore shipments, supply costs, and payroll for a mining operation. It was the real record of the Tanner Creek claim. Finch hadn't just started prospecting. He had been actively working the mine in secret for weeks, pulling out significant quantities of high-grade silver ore and shipping it out through a different county to avoid notice. He had been lying to everyone. The mine wasn't a bust, it was a treasure trove, and he was stealing it. Her father had been right all along. The final item was a single sheet of paper, folded into a small square and tucked into a pocket at the back of the ledger. It felt different from the official documents. The paper softer, the folds more pronounced. She carefully unfolded it. It was a letter, hastily written, the ink slightly smeared in one corner. As she read the words, the air in the small shack seemed to grow thin and cold, and the sound of the river outside faded to a dull roar. It was in Finch's hand, and it was addressed to her stepbrother. Cassius, it is done. The old man put up more of a fight than I expected up at the creek. Had to hit him harder than I planned. He went into the water and did not come up. The boat is loaded with the papers and his real ledger. I'll sink it in the deep channel above the falls, and we can pull it up next spring when the fuss dies down. Your mother is to play her part. You get the house, I get the mine free and clear. Burn this. J.F. Bertie read the letter once, then twice, then a third time. The words burned themselves into her mind. It is done. Had to hit him harder than I planned. Her father hadn't slipped. He hadn't fallen. He had been murdered, struck down by his own partner, his body thrown into the river like so much trash. And Cassius, her stepbrother, was part of it. The debts, the sale of the house, her eviction. It wasn't just business. It was a conspiracy to get rid of her, to erase every trace of her father so they could steal his legacy. The quiet, administrative cruelty of that day at the kitchen table was suddenly cast in a sickening new light. It was the final act of a murder. She sat on the floor of the dark workshop, the letter in one hand, the candle flame casting a trembling light on her pale face. The grief she felt was no longer the dull, heavy ache of loss, but a sharp, clean agony. It was the grief for a man stolen from the world, for a life cut short by greed and betrayal. In her pocket, her fingers found the smooth, familiar shape of the carved wooden bird. She pulled it out and held it in her other hand. The small piece of wood felt solid, real, a tangible link to the man they had taken from her. The girl who had been cast out was gone. In her place sat a woman with a terrible, clarifying purpose. The sun rose the next morning on a world that was utterly changed. The quiet endurance that had sustained Bertie through her grief and hardship had been burned away in the night, reforged into something harder and colder. Resolve. She knew she could not simply walk into the sheriff's office. She was a destitute young woman with a wild story about a letter found in a sunken boat. Finch was a man of growing importance in the region, and Cassius, though less respected, was still from a family that had held a place in the town. They would dismiss her, question her motives, and perhaps even accuse her of forging the letter herself. Finch and Cassius would be alerted, and the evidence could disappear. No, she would not go to the law. Not yet. The law required proof, but men respected power. The deeds and the ledger were her power. She spent the morning making preparations. She took the damning letter and sealed it inside a small tin box, which she then hid deep within the walls of Silas's shack, behind a loose stone in the fireplace. The deeds and the ledger she wrapped carefully and placed at the bottom of her canvas satchel. From the wreck of the rowboat, she salvaged the best of the cedar planks, the ones that were unscarred, and tied them into a manageable bundle. She packed a small sack with the last of her flour, some salt, and a tin of dried beans. She took her father's whetstone, small axe, and the pry bar from the workshop. Just before dawn, carrying her bundle of wood and her satchel of secrets, she left the river behind and started up the trail that led into the foothills toward Tanner Creek. It was a long and arduous journey on foot, more than 15 miles of steep, winding track. She walked with a steady, relentless pace, her body fueled by a purpose that transcended fatigue. She was not just walking to a place on a map. She was walking to reclaim her father's life. She arrived at the location late the next day. It was not the abandoned prospector's hole Finch had described. A new shaft, timbered and deep, had been cut into the mountainside. An ore cart sat on a short length of newly laid track. Nearby stood a crude, hastily built cabin, a thin plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. Several men were working near the mine entrance, their faces grim with labor. They stopped and stared as she approached, alone. Dusty figure of a girl carrying a bundle of wood. A large, barrel-chested man with a thick, gray-streaked beard stepped forward. He was clearly the foreman. "This is private property, miss. Best you turn back." Bertie said nothing. She walked directly up to him, dropped her bundle of cedar planks on the ground, and opened her satchel. She took out the deed to the Tanner Creek lode, the one with her father's true signature, and held it out to him. The foreman, whose name she would learn was Gus, took the paper and read it, his brow furrowed in confusion. "This is Thomas Hollis's claim," he said, more a statement than a question. "I am his daughter," Bertie said, her voice clear and even. She then took out Finch's ledger. She didn't hand it to him. She opened it to a page detailing ore shipments and payroll. "And this is Mr. Finch's private account book," she said, her voice loud enough for the other miners to hear. "It shows he's been pulling $20 a pound ore out of this mountain for 2 months. And it shows he's been paying all of you half of what a miner is owed for this grade of work." A silence fell over the camp. The men stopped their work and gathered closer, their eyes moving from the small girl to the foreman's face. Gus stared at the numbers in the ledger, his expression hardening. He and the others had suspected Finch was cheating them, but they had no proof. Now here it was, in black and white, delivered by the ghost of the man they had all been told had failed. "Mr. Finch has been lying to you," Bertie stated simply. "He lied about this mine, and he lied about my father." Gus was a hard man, but not a dishonest one. He had worked claims from California to the Fraser River, and he knew the look of a cooked ledger when he saw one. He passed the book to the man next to him, a wiry miner named Pete. The men murmured amongst themselves, their expressions shifting from suspicion of Bertie to a cold, simmering anger directed at their employer. The numbers in the ledger confirmed what their aching backs and light pockets had been telling them for weeks. They were being robbed. The next morning, when Jacob Finch rode into the camp on his handsome bay gelding, expecting to see a crew of compliant laborers, he was met by a wall of silent, unmoving men. Gus stood at their head, his arms crossed over his massive chest. Birdie stood off to the side, near the cabin, a quiet observer to the storm she had unleashed. "What is the meaning of this?" Finch demanded, his voice sharp with irritation. "Why aren't you men working?" Gus held up the ledger. "We've had a look at your real books, Mr. Finch." Finch's face went pale. His eyes darted from the ledger to the grim faces of the miners, and then they landed on Birdie. A look of pure, venomous hatred twisted his features. "You," he hissed. He began to bluster, to deny, to threaten. He called them liars and thieves, but his protestations were hollow against the damning evidence of his own handwriting. Gus tossed the ledger onto the ground at Finch's feet. "We're done working for shares of nothing," the foreman said, his voice a low growl. "This is Hollis's claim. We quit." One by one, the other miners turned their backs on Finch, gathered their personal tools, and started walking down the mountain trail. Finch, his face a mask of fury and humiliation, was left standing alone. He shot one last murderous glare at Birdie, then wrenched his horse around and galloped away, shouting threats of lawyers and retribution. The silence he left behind was profound. Birdie now possessed the mine, but she was alone. The miners were gone, and she had no crew to work the claim. She moved into the crude cabin, which was little more than a drafty box of green lumber, and began the work herself. She knew the principles of mining from her father, but the physical labor was immense. For 3 days she worked alone, clearing debris, checking timbers, and trying to move the heavy ore cart. Then, on the 4th day, a figure appeared on the trail. It was Gus. He walked up to the cabin, holding his hat in his hands. "Your father was a good man," he said, not looking at her directly. "And Finch is a cheat. This is good rock. It ain't right it should sit here idle. I'll work for a fair share, if you'll have me." Birdie simply nodded, and just like that, she had her first partner. A few days later, another man arrived. He was older, with kind eyes and hands gnarled by a lifetime of labor. His name was Abel, and he had known her father years ago. He looked at the shoddy cabin, at the wind whistling through the cracks. "A person needs a sound roof over their head," he said gruffly. Abel was a carpenter by trade. He took the cedar planks Birdie had salvaged from the rowboat, the wood that had started everything, and with meticulous skill, he began to repair the cabin. He used the smooth, fragrant boards to patch the walls and line the inside, turning the shack into a snug and worthy shelter. Soon after, another visitor made the trek up the mountain. It was not a miner, but an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, a widow whose husband had also been a prospector. She carried a basket containing a steaming pot of venison stew and a fresh loaf of bread. "A body can't live on grit and determination alone," she announced, setting the basket on the small table. From then on, she made the trip twice a week, a silent, steady offering of nourishment and solidarity. The community grew, one quiet act at a time. Henderson, the blacksmith from town, heard the story and rode up to sharpen her father's old pickaxes and drills for free. Pete, the wiry miner, returned with 2 others, ready to work for a woman they respected rather than a man who had cheated them. They did not work for wages but for shares in the mine's future, becoming not employees but partners. Together they were building something new, an enterprise founded not on a lie, but on the truth Birdie had pulled from the river, with the mine producing a steady stream of high-grade silver and a loyal crew of partners by her side. Birdie Hollis was no longer a destitute orphan. She was the proprietor of the Tanner Creek Lode, a position of substance and authority earned through grit and integrity. The small community they had formed on the mountainside was one of mutual respect, its bonds forged in shared labor and the common goal of seeing justice done. After 2 months of hard work, they had amassed enough ore and enough capital. The time had come to face Finch and Cassius. Birdie, Gus, and Abel rode down from the mountain. They were no longer a solitary girl and 2 disgruntled miners. They were a delegation, representing a legitimate and profitable enterprise. They did not stop at the edge of town, but rode directly to the sheriff's office on the main street. Sheriff Miller was a weary man who preferred to deal with drunkards and petty thieves, not complicated matters of property and murder. When Bertie had been alone, he might have dismissed her out of hand. But now she entered his office flanked by Gus, whose formidable presence filled the doorway, and Abel, a man known throughout the county for his quiet honesty. Bertie laid her evidence on the sheriff's desk with the same deliberate calm she had used to dismantle the rowboat. First, the forged bill of sale for the mine. Second, Finch's ledger, open to the pages that proved his fraud against the miners. Third, the original deed in her father's name. And finally, she produced the small, folded letter, its words stark and brutal in the quiet office. She told the story from the beginning. The murder, the sinking of the boat, the conspiracy with her stepbrother, the theft of her home. Gus and Abel stood by, their silent presence a powerful testament to the truth of her words. Sheriff Miller read the letter, his expression growing grimmer with each line. He looked at the ledger, at the deeds, and then at the determined face of the young woman before him. He was a town sheriff, not a fool. He had the physical evidence, the motive of immense profit, and the corroborating testimony of respected men. He had no choice but to act. Warrants were issued for the arrests of Jacob Finch and Cassius Thorne. Finch was apprehended at the hotel where he had been living, blustering about his rights and his lawyers, until the sheriff showed him his own letter. He fell silent. Cassius was arrested at the small apartment he shared with his mother. He collapsed into tears, confessing his part in the conspiracy before they even reached the jail. The town that had first pitied, then mocked Bertie, was now electrified by the scandal. The story of the prospector's murdered father, the greedy partner, the treacherous stepbrother, and the daughter who brought them all to justice became the legend of the county. Her stepmother, Eleanor, disgraced and implicated by her son's confession, packed her bags and left town on the next stagecoach, vanishing without a word. Bertie Hollis became a name spoken with a new kind of reverence. She ran the Tanner Creek mine with a steady hand, ensuring every partner received their fair and honest share. The mine thrived, and so did the small community around it. She used some of the profits to buy her father's house back, not to live in, but to turn into a boarding house for miners' widows, with Mrs. Gable as its manager. Her own home was the cabin on the mountain, the one Abel had so carefully rebuilt, the walls now paneled with the smooth, fragrant cedar from the boat that had delivered her father's last testament. A year passed. Winter came again to the high country, blanketing the mountainside in a deep, quieting layer of snow. Inside the cabin on Tanner Creek, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm, golden light across the room. The air was filled with the scent of pine smoke from the fire, the rich aroma of Mrs. Gable's baking from the small oven, and the faint, clean smell of the cedar-paneled walls. The cabin was no longer a crude shelter but a home, solid and warm against the winter wind. Bertie sat at a sturdy oak desk that had once been her father's. She had paid to have it hauled up the mountain, a piece of her past now firmly planted in her future. She was going over the mine's ledgers, not with the anxiety of debt, but with the quiet satisfaction of prosperity. The Tanner Creek lode was one of the most successful small mines in the region. Gus, Abel, Pete, and the others were not just her partners. They were her family, a community built on a foundation of truth. On the corner of the desk, where the light from the fire caught them, sat two small objects. One was the little wren her father had carved for her from mountain mahogany, its wood dark and smooth from years of being carried in her pocket. Next to it rested a small, rectangular block of wood, sanded to a silken finish. It was a piece of the cedar planking from the rowboat, the very plank she had pried loose on that fateful evening by the river. She put down her pen and picked up the carved bird, its familiar weight a comfort in her palm. She thought of her father, not of the violent manner of his death, but of his unshakable belief, his dreamer's heart that had seen a treasure in this rock. She thought of Silas Croft, the quiet boatwright who had taught her that nothing is ever truly lost if you have the patience to see its worth. And she thought of the people in the town below, the ones who had seen only a foolish girl and a piece of floating trash. She looked from the bird to the piece of the boat, one a symbol of a father's love, the other a symbol of his vindication. They were just two small pieces of wood, but they held the whole story. Birdie Hollis was 21 when she was put out of her home. She had $6 to her name, and she spent it all on a sunken boat. It was the best $6 she ever spent. From the cold water of the river, she had salvaged more than just timber and a secret. She had salvaged her father's name, she had reclaimed her future, and she had built, with her own two hands, a home.